I made a video on the Night City we never got, I think about 7 or 8 months ago now, which was focused on this pre-release image of the game's minimap, which is where I spent a good amount of time rambling after a few pints about areas of Night City that were clearly planned and intended to be in the game at some point in time, but never actually made it to the final build of 2077. Well, I'm pleased to say that this is not the only image of pre-release Night City that we can access. In fact, I've got my grubby little paws on 2 additional images which shed light on how Night City could and would have behaved in earlier versions of Cyberpunk 2077. Okay, so this is the first map which you're going to be taking a look at. All of these pre-release maps have the general kind of look and feel that you come to expect. So first and foremost, the one thing which I really want to draw attention to on this pre-release map is airports. We have not 1, but 2 airports in this pre-release version of Night City. Upon looking at this, I was kind of scratching my head for quite a while, trying to work out what the fuck an airport even is in Cyberpunk. We know that traditional planes, to my knowledge, don't really exist in this universe, because we mostly have the AVs, which are either commercial or military. I'm not the biggest sweat on Cyberpunk lore, so correct me if I'm wrong, but this seems kind of out of place to me. The only other thing which I could potentially think about is the fact that airport is actually a reference to orbital air, which we know was added with the Phantom Liberty expansion, but the fact that there's not 1 but 2 airports in this early version of Night City I think is really interesting. Of course, first of all, we have one which is up top near Westbrook or near North Oak, and if you visit this location in-game, there's nothing. There's literally nothing. This is just part of a kind of mountainous region that doesn't really have a great amount going on. Right next to the airport is where the oil fields are in the base release of 2077. Here we don't have that. In fact, we actually have a harbour, which does kind of exist in the final build of the game, but I wouldn't say it's this similar to how it's pictured on the map. And the airport at the southern part of the map is basically where the Biotechnica flats would be in the base release of the game. And like in the last video where the Biotechnica flats were not present on this earlier version of Night City, yet again we are presented with a different location in place of the Biotechnica flats. This does always make me wonder why the Biotechnica flats are never featured on older versions of Night City. To my knowledge, these are a pretty integral part of Night City. They're a pretty big contender in the lore, particularly to do with how food is produced. And from what we can tell from various different pre-release maps, it does seem likely that the Biotechnica flats was added in later in development, possibly when the idea of an airport was scrapped. If we actually take a look at the airport itself, we get into this sort of weird grey area where it's hard to tell what was basically a concept and what was actually going to be modelled. And, you know, I'm no expert, but from what I can tell, all of these white squares and rectangles and shapes, to me at least, represent buildings that either will be modelled or have been modelled or are intended to be physical aspects of Night City. And this is all plastered on top of what I assume to be some kind of procedurally generated Google Earth kind of thing, like these gigantic roads and what looks like a massive neighborhood in Pacifica. I don't think can be taken to be, oh, well, there was supposed to be a North Oak in Pacifica. No, I think it's more like a template. Was this actually supposed to be how it looks? I mean, we even have terminals here which look pretty, you know, accurate to how airports are actually laid out in the real world. Or is this again just some kind of concept off of Google Images with the intention of being some kind of a placeholder? Who knows? We of course have this gigantic road here which is called Skyline Drive, and this would originally have connected to the Cosmodrome, or what is now Orbital Air, and I've covered this in a video before. But Skyline Drive is really interesting to me because it's essentially just a gigantic motorway or a highway, whatever you want to call it. This is how I interpret it, at least, which basically goes round pretty much the entirety of Night City, doing what is basically like a gigantic loop, going all the way through Old North Oak, which is like triple the size as it is in the base release, going past Santo Domingo, and then linking up with Old Pacifica as well. We do kind of have something which resembles this in the base game, but it's been brought in a lot closer, so I think it's more around this area here as opposed to the outer reaches of the map. So who knows, maybe this also turned into some kind of an NCART station. I'm not entirely sure. Speaking of NCART stations, I'm pretty sure that these yellow lines here are supposed to represent NCART lines, mostly because this one here, which goes all the way through the Arasaka waterfront, is pretty much near enough how it is in the actual build of the game. And interestingly, we know that this NCART line is also not used. Even with the NCART update, this still remains a kind of weird part of the game, which doesn't really get a lot of love. But then that also does seem to suggest that there was an NCART line going through North Oak, which is pretty cool. And these, of course, all link up with Corpo Plaza, which makes sense. This is a huge NCART station. Whilst we're in this surrounding area as well, I can't help but have a look at North Oak because this place is just so absolutely fascinating. The first thing is that there's actually a bay. There's some kind of a port attached to North Oaks, which just does not exist in the base release of the game. But then we have, of course, this gigantic residential area, which is also broken up into little sub-districts. So North Oak and Westbrook made it into the game, and Hillside as well, I think. But then we just have Oaks on its own, which is pretty cool. Dustin, which is also not in the game to my knowledge. And then Mariposa Acres, which I would assume to be some kind of bougie mansion, Beverly Hills kind of place. What's pretty cool though is that Dustin is actually available to be viewed in Wolvenkit. Parts of terrain in North Oak are still labelled with these categorizations. Now, one of the biggest things which I need to talk about is again in Pacifica. Pacifica is so interesting to me because obviously this place in the base release of Cyberpunk had quite literally half of the district unfinished, where the combat zone was, or what is now formerly Dogtown. So something clearly fucked up in pre-release versions of this game, because in pretty much all early versions of Night City, Pacifica is completed. It's not just half of the district, it's very much here. What's pretty cool though about this version of Pacifica is that we actually have Arcology as a district. Now, Arcology is in place of Dogtown, or what would be the combat zone if we're looking at 1.0 Cyberpunk. And the Pacifica Arcology was actually a location which was present in Cyberpunk 2020. I'm going to read you the description of this place because I think it's really interesting. The Pacifica Arcology was located on the southwestern area of Pacifica, and in 2020 on the towering beachside cliffs 4 miles south of the centre of Pacifica stood the fortress-like sprawl of the Pacifica Arcology, built by foreign investors fleeing the collapse of Hong Kong in 1999. The Arcology was a mega building 10 times the size of the new Harbour Mallplex, housing almost 100,000 people in its 7 square miles. The Pacifica Arcology residents were rarely seen and didn't often associate with other Pacifica locals. So this is really fucking interesting for a number of different reasons. I think first of all, just the idea of the Pacifica Arcology is crazy. As someone that knows very little about Cyberpunk 2020, this concept I think is one of, if not the most Cyberpunk-esque elements I have ever read and heard of. Having a gigantic mega building with 100,000 people crammed into 7 square miles is so utterly dystopian. It almost makes me a bit upset that this didn't make it into the final build of the game, especially when mega buildings look pretty big and look pretty dense, but in actual gameplay terms are little more than set dressing. This would have been a really interesting addition to Cyberpunk, particularly because it's in Pacifica. But then again, this also begs the question, why on earth is the Pacifica Arcology in the 2077 version of Cyberpunk? That's 57 years late. What the hell happened? I have a couple theories on why or how this made it into pre-release versions of the map. If you guys have any better ideas, please do let me know though, because I'm probably not the best person to start talking about Cyberpunk lore. I think first of all, it may be likely that early versions of Night City were perhaps heavily inspired by Cyberpunk 2020. Perhaps when sort of deciding how to create Night City, CDPR initially wanted to go more of the 2020 route, borrowing heavily from the source material as opposed to flinging the setting into the far future where the map would be different. Maybe this acted as some kind of a baseline to get some kind of a general idea of how Night City should look, and then as time has gone on, particularly when story elements get more sort of introduced and fleshed out, these earlier versions of Cyberpunk 2020 were inevitably cut from the game. I want to focus our attention now on the Cosmodrome. Again, this is really interesting because, like the last pre-release video, this was featured on earlier versions of Night City, and again, we know that this location did not make it to the base release of Cyberpunk. Once again, this kind of confuses me because, you know, Cosmodrome as a name, I can't find anything relating to what this means, if this is tied to some part of 2020 or other Cyberpunk lore. I've done a fair amount of research on this and genuinely I can't find any kind of reason why it would be labelled this, apart from the fact that you can find references to Cosmodrome again in Wolfenkit, very similar to the internal code names of areas of the map. We also have the Upper Marina, which is pretty cool, and also New Harbour as well, and again I find this interesting. One thing to bear in mind as well is that this whole Upper Marina area is, at least in 2020, tied to this thing called the Night City Yacht Club. A yacht. It's an expensive boat, guys, which saw a fair amount of corporate visitors come into this exclusive club, and they also had a modern ferry building as well, which connected this area of Night City with the suburbs of North Oak and Pacifica. So this is pretty cool for a number of different reasons, but first of all because North Oak did have a port, right? Pacifica also did have a port. So it's pretty cool that the Upper Marina and New Harbour are actually kind of logical. They make sense to connect to other parts of Night City, but then they also, again, to tie it to the Pacifica arcology, only make sense in terms of Cyberpunk 2020. This does indeed make me question whether Cyberpunk was supposed to be a direct inspiration of Cyberpunk 2020 as opposed to 2077. Who fucking knows, but the evidence does seem to pile up. And if you aren't convinced by this, let me show you something else. On another pre-release version of Night City, we can see that there are indeed icons for ferries and for ports featured on the map. Here is the Upper Marina, which is labelled with a ferry, and this connects to the Arasaka waterfront. It doesn't, however, connect to North Oak. This port has been taken out, and it even connects up to the docks, which are to the right of the Arasaka waterfront. This is pretty cool, and yet again, we even have things like the airport, which are literally labelled. So I think it's fairly safe to say that aquatic travel was at least somewhat thought of in earlier versions of Cyberpunk's map. As always, guys, I want to know what you think on the matter. What do you think is going on with all of these Cyberpunk 2020 elements? Please do let me know in the comment section of the video. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you lot in a bit.